This is a restricted construction zone. You need to leave now. Victoria Iron Lady Blackwood, the 52-year-old senior site supervisor at Bayshore Marina Construction, barked those words at a quiet 68-year-old man in a simple blue cap who was watching her underwater foundation project from the public sidewalk. She saw him as just another curious retiree wasting her time during a critical construction phase. But in exactly 12 minutes, when construction diver Danny Park would become trapped 15 feet underwater beneath a shifted concrete foundation block with his air supply failing and hypothermia setting in, that interfering old man would risk his own life in the most dangerous improvised rescue in the site's history, proving that some people don't just watch emergencies unfold, they dive headfirst into them. Before we dive into this story of assumptions, courage, and a rescue that violated every safety protocol while saving a life, tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated because of your age? And if you believe that true heroism means risking everything for a stranger, hit that subscribe button because this story will show you that the most dangerous rescues are sometimes performed by the people others least expect. The morning fog was lifting over San Francisco Bay as Frank "Tank" Morrison took his usual quiet walk along the Marina District waterfront. At 68 years old, with weathered skin and gray hair beneath his simple blue cap, Frank moved with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned that life's most important moments rarely announced themselves with fanfare. He was visiting his daughter Sarah in the city and had decided to walk before catching the bus back to Sacramento. The rhythmic sounds of heavy construction drew his attention toward Bayshore Marina, where a massive expansion project was transforming the harbor with floating platforms, towering cranes, and the controlled chaos of major marine construction. Frank paused at the chain-link fence separating the public sidewalk from the worksite. His trained eyes automatically assessed the underwater operation, massive concrete caisson foundations being lowered 15 feet beneath the surface. A complex dance of crane operators, surface crews, and commercial divers working in the cold bay water. The precision required for this type of marine construction brought back memories of similar operations he had supervised during his Navy career, though those had been under considerably more hostile conditions. "Impressive engineering," he murmured, watching a diver disappear beneath the surface to guide a foundation block into position. "Hey, you!" The sharp voice cut through the morning air with unmistakable authority. Frank turned to see a tall woman in her early 50s striding toward the fence with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Victoria Blackwood stood nearly 6 feet tall, her silver hair pulled back severely, steel gray eyes fixed on Frank with obvious irritation. Her hard hat bore the title Senior Site Supervisor, and 23 years of managing construction crews in a male-dominated industry had given her an aura of absolute control. She had earned her position through competence and determination, fighting every step of the way against those who doubted a woman could handle heavy construction management. That experience had made her protective of her authority and suspicious of anyone who might undermine her carefully established credibility. "This is a restricted construction zone," Victoria announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "The public viewing area is 3 blocks down. You can't loiter here." Frank removed his cap politely, revealing more of his gray hair and the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent in harsh conditions. "I apologize, ma'am. I was just admiring the complexity of your underwater foundation work. Quite an operation you're running." Victoria's eyes narrowed. In her experience, civilians who lingered at construction sites fell into predictable categories: troublemakers looking to cause problems or retirees with too much time. This elderly man clearly belonged to the latter group. "Engineering isn't entertainment," she replied curtly. "This is a multi-million-dollar operation with heavy machinery, underwater welding, and commercial diving. We don't need spectators creating liability issues." "Of course," Frank nodded respectfully. "I understand completely." But as he started to turn away, a commotion erupted from the nearest floating platform. Voices began shouting, and Frank's trained ear immediately recognized the distinctive tone of crisis. "Emergency! Emergency!" The voice belonged to Carlos Mendez, a crane operator whose usual steady demeanor had cracked completely. "Danny's trapped!" The foundation block shifted. Frank froze. Every nerve suddenly alert, Victoria spun toward the water, her irritation instantly replaced by the focused intensity of a manager facing disaster. On the platform, workers were gathering at the edge, their faces pale with concern. Carlos was pointing frantically toward choppy water where bubbles rose to the surface, but the pattern was wrong, erratic, panicked. "What happened?" Victoria demanded, grabbing her radio and striding toward the platform access ramp. Carlos's voice cracked. Danny was positioning the north foundation block when the cradle cable snapped. The whole assembly shifted and pinned his leg. He's trapped 15 feet down, and his airline got damaged in the collapse. Victoria's face went white. Danny Park was their best underwater worker, a 26-year-old Korean-American diver whose technical skills had earned respect throughout the crew. But trapped underwater with compromised air supply, even the world's best diver was racing against an unforgiving countdown. "How long has he been down?" Victoria shouted into her radio. 7 minutes, Carlos replied, his hands shaking. "The backup diver is suiting up, but it'll take at least 10 more minutes to get him ready." Victoria's mind raced through the math. 17 minutes total. If Danny's air supply had been compromised, he might not have 10 minutes left. Frank had moved closer during the crisis, his presence forgotten by everyone except his own conscience. His eyes tracked the bubble pattern, and his experienced mind automatically calculated depth, air consumption rates, and the devastating effects of cold water on human endurance. "Ma'am," Frank said quietly, approaching Victoria. She spun around, her face flushed with crisis adrenaline. "I told you to leave. This is an emergency." "I know," Frank replied, his voice remaining calm despite the urgency. "That's why I think I can help." Victoria stared at him as if he had suggested flying to the moon. "Help! Sir, this is a professional underwater rescue operation. We have certified divers, safety equipment, and emergency protocols. What we don't need is a civilian getting in the way." Frank looked past her toward the water, where the bubble pattern was becoming more erratic. "Those bubbles are coming up every 15 seconds instead of 8. He's trying to conserve air, which means he knows his supply is compromised. In water this cold, he has maybe 5 more minutes before hypothermia affects his judgment." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't the kind of observation she would expect from a random retiree. "Are you some kind of former lifeguard?" she asked sarcastically. "Because unless you have professional diving certification and 20 years of commercial underwater experience, your observations aren't helping anyone." "No, ma'am," Frank said simply. "Not a lifeguard." The bubbles on the surface suddenly stopped completely. Complete silence fell over the construction site. 20 hardened construction workers stood frozen at the platform's edge, staring at dark water that had gone ominously still. "Danny!" Carlos shouted toward the water, his voice cracking with desperation. "Danny, respond!" Nothing. No bubbles. No movement. Victoria grabbed her radio with shaking hands. "Emergency coordinator, this is Blackwood. We have a diver down with no surface indication. I need Coast Guard rescue coordination immediately." The radio crackled back. "Backup diver needs 6 more minutes for full safety prep. Coast Guard helicopter is 15 minutes out." Victoria's face went ashen. She had never watched someone's life slip away while she stood helpless on the surface, bound by safety protocols that suddenly felt like death sentences. "Ma'am," Frank said again, his voice steady but urgent. "I can get him." This time, Victoria didn't bother hiding her incredulity. "You can get him? Sir, are you having some kind of medical episode? Because a 68-year-old civilian cannot perform a commercial rescue dive." Frank met her gaze steadily. "Danny's unconscious, probably from CO2 buildup when his regulator malfunctioned. He's got maybe 3 minutes before brain damage becomes irreversible. Your backup diver is excellent, but he'll need time to assess the debris field. Time Danny doesn't have." Frank was already removing his jacket, revealing arms that were still strong despite his age, and a faded tattoo on his forearm that Victoria didn't recognize. "Ma'am, that young man is dying while we debate. I can hold my breath for 4 minutes. I know how to work around underwater debris, and I understand structural collapse dynamics. But most importantly, I'm here now." Victoria felt her worldview tilting dangerously. This elderly man wasn't speaking like a civilian anymore. His vocabulary had shifted to technical precision. His demeanor had changed from polite deference to calm authority. "You're serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dead serious," Frank replied, kicking off his shoes. "But I need your permission to enter the water from your platform." Victoria's mind raced. Every safety protocol screamed against allowing an untrained civilian into an active rescue zone, but something deeper was telling her that this quiet elderly man might be Danny's only chance. "Who are you?" she asked. Frank was already at the platform's edge, testing the water temperature. "Someone who doesn't let people drown when he can help." Carlos suddenly shouted from his crane position. "I see him! 15 feet down, northwest corner of the foundation block. He's not moving." Frank looked at Victoria one last time. "Ma'am, I need your decision. Now." Victoria had built her career on making tough decisions under pressure, but she had never been asked to bet someone's life on her judgment of a complete stranger. "If you die down there, it ends my career," she said grimly. "If I don't try, it ends his life," Frank replied. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Frank was watching her with patient certainty. "Do it," she whispered. Then, louder, "All crews clear the rescue area. We have an emergency civilian assist." Frank nodded once, took 3 deep breaths to oxygenate his blood, and stepped off the platform into the cold San Francisco Bay. The shock of 55-degree water hit Frank's system like a physical blow, but his body responded with muscle memory built over decades of cold water operations. He ignored the instant hypothermia response and focused on the controlled descent, his eyes adjusting to the murky underwater visibility. 15 feet down, the construction site's underwater landscape came into focus like an industrial nightmare. The concrete foundation block, easily 10 tons, had shifted when its support cradle failed, creating a debris field of bent rebar, tangled cables, and twisted metal framework. Pinned beneath the northeastern edge, Frank could see Danny Park's motionless form. Frank's oxygen-starved brain immediately began calculating the rescue geometry. Danny was trapped at an angle, his left leg pinned beneath the concrete block, while his upper body was wedged between collapsed rebar. His diving mask was still in place, but his regulator had been torn away, hanging uselessly 3 feet beyond reach. Danny's chest was rising and falling slightly, still alive but unconscious, breathing whatever air remained in his mouth and mask. Maybe 90 seconds before drowning became inevitable. Frank's own air supply was the bigger problem. He had been underwater for 45 seconds of his planned 4-minute breath hold, but cold water was burning oxygen faster than normal. Working methodically, Frank swam around the debris field, his hands exploring the tangle of metal and concrete, while his mind built a 3-dimensional map of the collapse. The foundation block couldn't be moved, but the rebar cage that had Danny wedged might be bendable if approached from the correct angle. Frank recognized the construction grade of steel, grade 60 rebar, with a yield strength that would require precise application of force. Too much pressure in the wrong direction could cause catastrophic failure that might crush Danny entirely. Too little, and the cage would spring back, making extraction impossible. Frank positioned himself above Danny's trapped form and began working on the bent rebar with controlled force. Years of underwater work had taught him to rely on technique rather than feeling. He gripped a section of twisted reinforcement bar and applied steady pressure, using his body position for leverage. The metal grudgingly began to bend. Inch by inch, Frank created a gap large enough for extraction, but the work was consuming oxygen at a devastating rate. His lungs were beginning to burn with carbon dioxide buildup. Danny stirred slightly, approaching the final stages of consciousness. In less than a minute, involuntary drowning reflexes would force him to inhale water. Frank repositioned himself, grabbed Danny under both arms, and pulled with everything he had left. Nothing. The angle was wrong. Frank's vision was beginning to narrow as oxygen deprivation affected his brain. He had maybe 60 seconds of useful consciousness remaining, but the rescue required at least 90 seconds to complete safely. He swam to Danny's regulator, grabbed it, and pressed it firmly against his own mouth. The damaged equipment delivered a small puff of air, not enough to restore full oxygen, but sufficient to buy perhaps 30 more seconds of clarity. Then Frank did something that would have horrified every diving safety expert. He removed his own shirt, wrapped it around the section of rebar, causing the worst binding, and used it as a fulcrum to bend the metal framework beyond his structural limits. The makeshift lever worked. With a grinding sound that Frank could feel through the water, the rebar cage bent enough to free Danny's leg. Frank grabbed Danny's diving harness and kicked toward the surface with desperate urgency. Both men were now beyond their safety margins. Frank was operating on pure adrenaline and decades of training, while Danny was unconscious and had been without proper air for nearly 2 minutes. The ascent felt endless. Frank's lungs were screaming for oxygen, his muscles were cramping from cold and exertion, and Danny's dead weight was making progress agonizingly slow. Frank's head broke the surface just as his body began shutting down from oxygen starvation. He gasped desperately, pulling Danny's face above water while treading frantically to keep them both afloat. "Got him!" Carlos screamed from the crane platform. "They're up." Victoria was already coordinating the surface rescue. "Get the rescue swimmer in the water. I need medical equipment on the platform now." 2 construction workers dove into the water to assist Frank, who was barely conscious himself but still maintaining his grip on Danny's diving harness. They formed a human chain to get both men back to the platform, where the site's emergency medical technician was waiting with oxygen and resuscitation equipment. Danny Park was unconscious but breathing. His pulse was weak but steady. The EMT immediately began warming procedures while administering high-flow oxygen. Frank collapsed on the platform, his 68-year-old body pushed far beyond reasonable limits. His lips were blue from cold, his hands were shaking uncontrollably, and he was breathing in ragged gasps. But he was watching Danny's face, and when the young man's eyes fluttered open and he began coughing up bay water, Frank allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Victoria Blackwood knelt beside Frank, wrapping him in an emergency blanket, while her mind struggled to process what she had just witnessed. "How?" she asked simply. Frank was too exhausted to speak, but Carlos provided the answer from his crane operator's perch. "Ma'am, I've been watching underwater operations for 15 years. What that man just did down there, that wasn't luck. That was professional-level technical diving under impossible conditions." Victoria studied Frank's weathered face, noting details she had missed during their initial confrontation. The way he moved with economy and precision, the tattoo on his forearm that she now realized depicted a naval special warfare insignia, the calm competence that had seemed out of place in an elderly civilian but made perfect sense in someone with serious military training. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice softer this time. Frank managed to catch his breath enough to respond. "Frank Morrison, ma'am. Retired." "Retired from what?" Frank looked at Danny, who was now sitting up and breathing normally, surrounded by EMTs and relieved coworkers. The young man would make a full recovery. "United States Navy," Frank said simply. "Underwater operations." The pieces clicked into place for Victoria like a lock opening. The technical vocabulary, the calm under pressure, the impossible dive that had saved Danny's life. This wasn't a random retiree who had gotten lucky. This was a former Navy SEAL who had spent his career doing exactly what he had just done. Victoria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she remembered her dismissive comments about age and capability. This man had risked his life to save one of her workers after she had treated him like a nuisance. "Sir," she began, but Frank was already standing, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders and preparing to leave. "Danny's going to be fine," he said, nodding toward the young man who was now laughing weakly with his rescuers. "Your backup diver did excellent work managing the surface coordination. You've got a good crew here." Victoria stood as well, her mind racing to find words adequate for what had just happened. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology, and Danny owes you his life." "No need," Frank interrupted gently. "I was in the right place at the right time. Anyone would have done the same." Carlos called down from the crane. "Anyone? Sir, I've been in marine construction for 20 years. What you just did was impossible. Nobody else could have pulled that off." As Frank prepared to leave, Danny Park struggled to his feet, supported by EMTs but determined to speak. His voice was hoarse from the near drowning, but his words carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "Sir," Danny said, extending his hand toward Frank, "I don't know who you are or why you risked everything for a stranger, but you saved my life. How do I thank someone for that?" Frank shook the young man's hand warmly. "You live well," he said simply. "You take care of your family, you help others when you can, and you remember that every day is a gift. That's thanks enough." Victoria watched this exchange with growing amazement. This man had performed a rescue that defied safety protocols and common sense, had literally risked his own life to save someone he had never met, and was now walking away as if it were just another morning walk. "Mr. Morrison," she called as Frank reached the platform's edge. "If you ever need anything, a job recommendation, a reference, anything at all, you call me immediately." Frank paused at the gangway, leading back to the public sidewalk. For a moment, Victoria thought he might turn around and accept some form of recognition. Instead, he simply nodded politely. "Just remember," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water, "next time someone seems out of place, consider that they might be exactly where they're supposed to be." Frank Morrison walked slowly back toward the public sidewalk, his wet clothes clinging to his body, and his steps still slightly unsteady from the physical ordeal. Behind him, the construction site buzzed with post-emergency activity, but Victoria couldn't focus on the bureaucratic aftermath. Her eyes remained fixed on the quiet figure disappearing into the morning crowd. "Carlos," she called up to the crane operator, who was still staring after Frank with amazement. "Run that back for me. What exactly did you see during the rescue?" Carlos shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I've been operating cranes over water for 15 years. What that man just did down there was master-level technical diving. The breath hold time, the underwater problem-solving, the way he engineered that rebar bend. That was someone who's done impossible rescues before." Danny Park, now wrapped in blankets and breathing normally, provided his own perspective. "When that foundation block shifted and my regulator got torn away, I knew I was in serious trouble. The rescue would require someone to work completely outside normal safety protocols. Someone would have to make a free dive to depth, assess a complex structural collapse, engineer a solution with no tools, and execute an extraction under impossible time pressure." Victoria was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had witnessed. She pulled out her phone and quickly searched Frank Morrison, Navy SEAL. The results made her stomach drop. Master Chief Frank Tank Morrison, 68, retired after 32 years with Naval Special Warfare, Silver Star recipient for underwater rescue operations in Somalia, multiple Bronze Stars for classified missions involving technical diving in hostile environments. Victoria looked up from her phone, her mind reeling. She had dismissed a Navy SEAL Master Chief as a nuisance civilian. She had questioned his qualifications while he was offering to save her employee's life. "Danny," she said, her voice soft with newfound understanding, "I think we both learned something important today about not judging people by their appearance." The young diver nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, when I get married next month, I'm going to tell my wife this story about the day a quiet old man turned out to be exactly the hero I needed." Victoria made a mental note to revise her employee training programs. From now on, her crews would understand that expertise comes in many forms, and that true professionals are identified not by their credentials, but by their willingness to act when lives are on the line. She would also establish new protocols for recognizing and utilizing the skills of experienced individuals who might appear at emergency scenes, regardless of their official status or apparent qualifications. Frank Morrison had walked away from the construction site as quietly as he had arrived, asking for nothing and expecting no recognition, but his actions had left a permanent impact, a reminder that genuine heroism often goes unnoticed until the moment when someone's life depends on it. 6 months later, Frank received an unexpected visitor at his Sacramento home. Danny Park, now married and expecting his first child, had driven up from the Bay Area. "Mr. Morrison," Danny said, standing on Frank's front porch with his wife beside him, "we're naming our son Frank, and we'd like to ask if you would consider being his godfather." Frank studied the young couple, seeing in their faces the kind of gratitude that couldn't be expressed in words. Danny had recovered completely and had been promoted to senior diving supervisor at Bayshore Marina. "I'd be honored," Frank replied simply. Later that evening, Frank sat on his back porch watching the sunset over the Sacramento Valley. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Blackwood. "Mr. Morrison wanted you to know that the safety program you inspired has prevented 3 serious accidents this year. Thank you for showing us that heroism often comes in unexpected packages." Frank smiled and put the phone aside without replying. He had learned long ago that the most meaningful actions required no response except the willingness to act again when circumstances demanded it. As darkness settled over Sacramento, Frank Morrison, retired Navy SEAL Master Chief, reluctant hero and soon-to-be godfather, prepared for bed with the quiet satisfaction that comes from a life spent in service to others. Tomorrow would bring another day, another opportunity to be exactly where he was supposed to be when someone might need help. And somewhere in San Francisco, a young construction diver was falling asleep next to his pregnant wife, secure in the knowledge that his son would grow up in a world where genuine heroes walked quietly among us, ready to risk everything for strangers who might need their help. Because some people don't just watch emergencies unfold, they dive headfirst into them, asking for nothing except the opportunity to make a difference when it matters most.